Días, buenas tardes, mejor que buenos días, que sean muy buenos para todos. Es un placer para nosotros tenerlos aquí en esta tarde donde vamos a presentar los informes o el outlook de la Energy Information Administration. Este evento será desarrollado en inglés, como hemos hecho en otras ocasiones. Esperemos que todos ustedes estén bien, puedan seguir de acuerdo a las instrucciones de esto. En este caso vamos a cambiar al idioma inglés y vamos a seguir en inglés durante toda esta presentación. We are going to switch in English. It's a pleasure having all of you here. You can see here John Staub, Senior Analyst of the Energy Information Administration. You can see Pablo de Juan, people here, and Erika Magallon. You haven't seen her, but I think you are going to see her just right now. Okay, it's a pleasure for us to try the first time to introduce and to present this outlook of the Energy Information Administration. We would like to thank Erika and the US Embassy in Spain for helping us to get in touch and board as John Staub at the people of the Energy Information Administration. As you know, the Energy Information Agency is the big information in the States in the area of energy. They collect a lot of data. They have their own models. They develop for many years this kind of forecast for the future in energy. And all of you know very well their projection and their outlook. They are presenting several outlook, the short-term outlook. They are presenting the international outlook, and they are presenting the global outlook. Now, I think the last global outlook 2020 was released last week. We appreciate that John will be here to present us, introduce all of you this study, this information from the agency. Well, we would like to thank Erika because she helped us a lot to connect with the Energy Information Administration. We have tried during many years to get in touch with them, but now we have the contact. No, this is the best we can say about this. Erika, Erika Magallon, she is the economic officer at the US Embassy in Madrid, where she covers energy, science, technology, the environment, and health. She came here to Spain in 2020, I think in the middle of 2020. She has helped a lot in this event we are developing now. And more for us, I think you can send your question to Pablo de Juan. You can send him to the email pablo.dejuan@enerclub.es, or you can put on the screen in this Q&A session. First of all, I'm going to give the floor to Erika to introduce not just a big one, the new American energy policy. This is a little bit complicated, but I'm completely sure she's going to give us some remarks about this and to introduce John Staub and his presentation. After this, we will have the Q&A session. Normally we have this kind of thing that you can send this question in this event to the Zoom question and answer, I think, comentarios o preguntas. No, you can send in Spanish or English because Pablo is going to translate to John the question you will send us in this situation. Erika, it's your turn. The floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you for helping us.
Thank you, Arcadio. Muchas gracias. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. My name is Erika Magallon. I'm an economic officer at the US Embassy in Madrid, Spain. Thank you, Energy Club, Club Español de la Energía, for hosting today's event with the US Energy Information Administration. This is a great opportunity to learn about the EIA's Annual Energy Outlook 2021, which Arcadio mentioned was just released on February 3rd, so about a week ago. Perfect timing for today's discussion. Before moving on to EIA's presentation, I'd just like to say a few very brief words about President Biden's commitment to tackle the climate crisis in the United States and abroad. As most of you probably heard, on his first day in office, President Biden signed an executive order to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. He strongly believes that addressing the climate crisis is an essential element of US foreign policy. His goal is to put America on a path to achieve a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035, double US offshore wind capacity by 2030, and to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. The United States is working on its nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. These are the long-term goals for reducing emissions. President Biden is pausing new oil and natural gas leases on public lands and offshore waters, and is reviewing existing permits related to fossil fuel development on public lands and water. He is also aiming to eliminate federal fossil fuel subsidies and identify new opportunities to deploy clean energy technologies and infrastructure. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the United States is pursuing green recovery efforts and will promote initiatives that advance a clean energy transition. With that, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, John Staub from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. John will speak with us today on important trends and projections for future U.S. energy use and supply. John is a senior advisor for energy analysis on the Quality and Innovation Council at the EIA. In this role, John leads strategic planning and product review across the agency's portfolio of analysis, modeling, and data. We are very lucky to have John with us today. He has worked in support of EIA's mission for nearly 20 years. His work has spanned much of the energy sector, from electricity and transportation to oil and natural gas resources, LNG trade, shale gas, biofuels, and technology. We are so happy to have you with us, John. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Arcadio and Pablo. Welcome. Today, I'm going to, let's share my screen quickly. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Today I'll talk about our three outlooks, as well as some background information about some of the questions that have come in so far. First, I want to give a little introduction about EIA and some of our unique role in the energy space. And then I'll talk about our short-term energy outlook, as well as, which comes out monthly, as well as our international energy outlook, which came out last fall, and then our annual energy outlook, which is domestically focused has linkages to the international market. So the Energy Information Administration is a unique part of the US government. We're part of the Department of Energy, but our vital role is to gather through surveys and use of third-party data, information about the energy markets, and then conduct analysis and develop forecasts of the short term, as well as scenario projections for the long term of how the market, both within the US and globally, may evolve as we look at different uncertainties. It's important to remember that with our annual energy outlook, we don't predict what will happen in the long term. Rather, we're providing projections of what may happen given certain assumptions about either policy or economic growth, et cetera. And those are very important in our analysis. So one thing I want to just kind of highlight for everyone real quickly is this is just a snapshot on our website. And there, if you want to look at our outlooks, the best place to look at is on the topics part of the bar here. That clicking on that will allow you to access quickly our short-term outlook, our annual energy outlook, and our international outlook. I also want to draw attention up on the top. There's a little button for tools, and that takes you to a place where you can see our many dashboards. We have dashboards for our natural gas storage report that comes out weekly. It's one of the US government's leading economic indicators. We also have dashboards for and data browsers for electric power markets, for international data. And there's just a variety of tools there. So just wanted to highlight that before I go too far. And at the end of the presentation, I have some links to some of the main pages. So in terms of our short-term energy outlook, and the short-term outlook is kind of an important starting point for our long-term outlooks, especially this year. in the midst of the demand side market shocks that we've experienced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Global consumption of liquid fuels fell by almost 20% in the spring, while liquids consumption bounced back rather quickly. The annual average for 2020 is down by 9 million barrels per day, and we expect it will take 2 years to return to the 2019 consumption level based on our most recent short-term energy outlook. EIA will continue to address the COVID-19 impacts in the short-term energy forecast, which is updated each month. And currently our forecast goes out through the end of 2022. And so despite the near-term demand impacts brought on by COVID-19, the long-term world energy demand is increasing. And if you remember from our international outlook, which came out in the fall, globally, we see an increase of more than 50% of energy demand or energy consumption between now and 2050. That increase in demand for energy will create opportunities and synergies and challenges for the United States and serves as a backdrop to our discussion of US energy markets. Just want to highlight too, back in the summer, we published a report named Trends and Expectations surrounding the outlook for energy markets that discusses some of the considerations that went into their AEO 2021. And we'll continue to update that as the pandemic progresses. So in our most recent international energy outlook, which came out in the fall, that publication was focused on electricity. We've added a new model that looks at electricity markets internationally. And so we produced 3 papers that discussed the exercising the model. So we've looked at one of the most important things, and I'll talk more about this domestically as well, but in terms of how natural gas and renewable power generation capabilities compete with each other to produce electricity in China and Asia. We also looked at how interregional trade in a country or region can be effectively modeled in India. And then we looked at how off-grid electricity development might unfold in Africa. So a variety of topics related to fuel mix trends and uncertainties, and that was the focus of the International Energy Outlook this past year. In terms of just providing kind of a little bit of diving into just one of them, the first paper there. In our China analysis, we looked at the competing technologies and the emissions policies. And what we see from that analysis is on the left-hand chart, a large increase from 2019 to 2050 in solar generation. Coal fueled electricity generation remains higher in the reference case than solar, but definitely getting closer. And then on the right-hand side, you see some scenarios that we've conducted. The first across the top here is looking at whether or not renewable capital costs come down or remain high or become lower. And then also looking at the price of natural gas, whether natural gas prices are high or low. You can see that in situations where capital costs for renewables are high, but natural gas prices are also high, there's a coal remains relatively strong. There's some increase in wind, but as you bring down the renewable capital costs, you get a much larger impact on increasing solar and pulling down coal. So there's a lot of information within the report, and happy to discuss that further. I just wanted to highlight that as from our most recent outlook on the international side. So turning to our annual energy outlook, this is our page here from our website, and there's a variety of material that we have. If you want to watch the release presentation, which is quite similar to what I'll be presenting today, there's a link to the Bipartisan Policy Center, which hosted the release. It's available on YouTube, as well as the discussion of the presentation itself. There's also information. We have this year a section called the narrative, and it involves a number of papers, short, similar to our Today in Energy series, discussions of key takeaways from the analysis. And then finally, there is an extensive chart library, data tables, etc. In terms of the kind of broad themes that emerged from our analysis for the AEO 2021, the first is that the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on energy consumption behavior and economic activity will have lasting impacts on aggregate US energy consumption and carbon dioxide emissions. In the high economic growth case, it takes 5 years to return to 2019 energy consumption levels. In the low economic growth case, it takes 30 years. Secondly, the changes in the electric power sector are being driven by a variety of incentives for renewable power generation. Advances in technology are lowering the cost of renewable electricity, including the cost of installing solar PV and the cost of energy storage and distribution systems to mitigate intermittent availability. All these changes support robust competition with natural gas. The trajectory of natural gas prices has a significant role in the amount of electricity produced from renewables versus natural gas. However, other power generation sources, such as coal and nuclear, struggle to maintain their market share in this competitive market. Third, the United States produces a record amount of crude oil and natural gas plant liquids and dry natural gas for the next 3 decades in our reference case and most of the side cases. In all of the cases, the US remains a net exporter of dry natural gas, but this is not the case for petroleum products. In the reference case, the US has a trade surplus of crude oil and petroleum products of up to 2 million barrels per day. In the side cases, with lower cost US resources or higher international oil prices, US net exports could expand to 7 to 10 million barrels a day. However, that trade surplus disappears in cases with lower international oil prices or more expensive US resources. Throughout these highlights, the international market looms large. Economic growth, technology, and investment decisions, and policy and incentives domestically and internationally will shape energy markets over the next 30 years. If your organization would prefer to view a different outcome, the AEO provides a projection, not a prediction. And so it provides a baseline from which a further analysis can be done. There are several kind of key assumptions that go into the annual energy outlook. There's actually a full report on our website that provides the assumptions as well as all the legislation and regulation that is built into the outlook. But here we listed a few of the key things. So first off, the reference case is focused on current laws and regulations as of September of 2020, and it assumes that they don't change. This is a little bit different than the IEA's STEPS scenario, which is a bit more expansive in terms of understanding, interpreting intentions, policy. Ours they have to be actually in force as of September 2020. We also have information or assumptions about economic and demographic trends, as well as technology improvement. The economic growth, compound annual growth rate for the US is an important factor in the outlook. In the reference case, we have 2.1% growth, and it's 0.5% higher in the high economic growth case and 0.5% lower in the low economic growth case. These cases come from IHS Markit, third party, from their economic model. And then in terms of oil prices and gas prices. Oil prices are a exogenous input, and we see that oil prices rise to $95 per barrel and constant $20 by 2050. In the reference case, they can get up as high as $173 per barrel in the high price case and $48 in the low price case. And this wide band of oil prices helps stress test a variety of parts of the analysis to understand how competition occurs between fuels and sectors. We also have cases that look at the supply of oil and gas in terms of, is it easier or more difficult and costly to extract resources. And then finally, we have two cases that look at renewable costs, and are they higher or lower than the reference case. In the low case, we assume that the cost of renewables declines 40% by 2050 relative to the reference case. So just as a kind of a summary of these 9 different cases that we've produced or included in the analysis this year, all of them are based upon current law and regulation. And then in alternate years, we do sometimes run additional cases, whether they're carbon fee cases or assumptions about different changes in policy, and those, but those were not done this year. So let's focusing on the first theme in terms of energy consumption. Here we have 2 charts showing the gross domestic product assumptions for the AEO on the left-hand side, and then the delivered energy use on the right-hand side of this chart. As we can see, the 2020 downturn in the U.S. economy, stemmed from the demand shocks, both direct and indirect, and they've delivered energy demand decreased 90% of its 2019 level, so about 10% decrease. And that was a steeper decline than what we saw in terms of real GDP. Compared to with the financial crisis of 2008, the COVID-19 related decline in total energy demand is about 70% larger. And total delivered energy consumption reference case returns to its 2019 levels in 2029, so about 10 years. Projections in the AEO 2021 focus on key factors driving long-term demand. So the growing economy, population, increasing use of renewables, increasing consumption of natural gas and electricity, changing technology and behavior, policy that affects the efficiency of vehicles and end-use equipment, even lighting. And these factors extend beyond the uncertainty resulting from the pandemic. So next slide. Here we have U.S. energy consumption by sector on the left graph and fuel on the right. Looking across the sectors in the reference case, we see in the left-hand chart that the majority of U.S. energy consumption growth comes from industrial and electric power sectors. This is because of competitively priced hydrocarbon gas liquids and natural gas for industrial manufacturing. And then beginning late in this decade, long-run growth in use of electricity across all the sectors. The right-hand chart highlights the steady growth in renewable energy, led by solar and wind, and then also natural gas post-2035. I'll discuss this a bit more later. In terms of consumption, energy consumption in the transportation sector, it remains lower than its 2019 levels for the entire projection period in the reference case, both because travel decreased in 2020 and also assumptions of improved efficiency fuel economy are offset in travel growth. The responses to the 2019 pandemic included mobility restrictions and limitations on non-essential travel, increased working from home, which greatly reduced long and short distance U.S. travel demands in 2020 compared with 2019. In the reference case, as travel decreases by nearly 2/3 and returns to 2019 levels in 2025, But bus travel decreased nearly half and returns to 2019 levels in 2031. And light duty vehicle travel returns to 2019 levels by 2024. What's quite striking about this chart is just how flat and unchanging these cases are. I feel like I missed the slide. It's not. And I think it's the thing that's probably the most noteworthy is you can see the increase in the industrial fuel use in the petroleum sector. That's tied to the liquefied petroleum gas, the blue line over here on the right-hand chart. So here we have carbon emissions. And as you can see, so far we've seen that petroleum use isn't changing too much. Natural gas use is increasing. And so here on this chart, see the reference case emissions. And we see the decline of coal, which is primarily the electric power sector on the left-hand chart. In terms of the changes, they reflect the energy consumption in post-2022 emissions are decreasing in the near term. So a bit of a bounce back in the very short term as market rebalances itself, as well as the short-term issues in terms of natural gas availability and prices that were forecasted last fall, heading into the winter. Looking kind of in the broad trends after 2035, emissions in the U.S. begin to trend upwards, reflecting the overall increase in U.S. energy usage as a result of increasing population and economic growth. And the trend holds true across cases, just because of the scale of the drivers that are involved. The high economic growth case has the largest increase in emissions, while the low economic growth case has the lowest. And so reductions in both energy intensity and carbon intensity, so those both dampen the effects of economic growth. And even in the high economic growth case, energy-related CO2 emissions remain lower than the 2007 peak of 6 billion metric tons throughout the projecting period to 2050. So in terms of the second highlight from the AEO, talk about electric power sector and renewables. It's really a focus on the competition between renewables and natural gas. And it's over the past decade plus, there's been a pretty significant decline in the cost for both ways of generating electricity, and it's expected to continue to remain competitive. Here we see U.S. electricity use, the growth rate on the left, and use by end sector on the right, both on-site generation and purchased electricity. And what's noteworthy on the left here is that while the past decade, 2010 through 2020, was pretty much at zero electricity growth, we do see a return to growth in the next 30 years, averaging about 1% per year. So it's just it's a pretty significant change in terms of kind of the rate of change of a particular type of fuel, here in this case electricity. In terms of net electricity generation, that's growing by about a third from 2020 to 2050. I'll discuss a little bit later that capacity increases by roughly 2/3. So that's also pretty significant. And let's see. Yes, one important thing as we think about the on-site generation versus the purchased electricity, there is a lot of effort to install solar PV on rooftops, and so that is kind of changing the market in terms of where the kind of opportunities are to install additional capacity. So this slide shows cumulative generating capacity and retirements in selected cases from 2021 to 2050. In 2020, the U.S. electric generating capacity was 1,150 gigawatts, and between 2020 and 2050, capacity increases anywhere between 50 to 84% across the AEO cases. Virtually all this growth is from solar, wind, and natural gas. Renewable electricity generating technologies account for almost 60% of the roughly 1,000 gigawatts of cumulative capacity additions in the AEO 2021 reference case, most significantly as a result of declining capital costs, but also as a result of increasing renewable portfolio standards and tax credits. Wind does contribute to the growth, but most of that's very near term, and solar builds occur throughout the projection period. The wind additions are largely tied to policy. So the production tax credit for wind is assumed to run through 2024, following a 1-month extension. Wind doesn't have quite the rate of cost reductions that solar does, and the wind has gone through a number of periods of short extensions to that production tax credit. And so the steadier pace of solar additions in part reflects the continued availability of investment tax credit, or ITC, and EIA assumes that solar receives a 30% investment tax credit through 2023, and then it reduces to a permanent value of 10% in 2024 and onward. Natural gas continues to be a fuel of choice amongst the fossil fuels. So the renewable electricity generating technologies account for about 60% of cumulative additions, and natural gas roughly represents 40% of the other generating capacity. It helps both balance out some of the intermittency of wind and solar. It also has cost competitive advantages. And then on the bottom of the chart, we see retirements. Most of the coal retirements are happening short term, and by 2025. After the AEO modeling was completed just a few weeks ago, the DC Circuit Court vacated the policy that was contributing to some of that planning of retirements for coal. And we didn't do a case that made that assumption for this AEO, but our prior outlook from 2020 did include cases that assumed that policy either stayed or was ended. And the effect was not too significant. So a lot of this really is market driven, especially low natural gas prices contributing to the retirements. Here we see electricity generation by fuel across the three cases. These cases are getting at the uncertainty in natural gas prices. So we use a low oil and gas supply case and a high oil and gas supply case to vary the price of natural gas to the market. You see in the left chart a reference case with quite flat natural gas through 2035, as you have the expansion of renewables really pushing into the market at that point in time. And gas prices have a pretty significant impact. If we, for example, look at the middle graph, where you have higher natural gas prices, in this case, renewables grow significantly relative to the reference case, and natural gas actually use declines in the electric power sector. Whereas on the right-hand chart, you see a case where gas prices are quite low, and so then a bit of a flip to more gas and not as much growth in renewables. Still growth, but just not as much. So just a point there to note. And then finally, looking at exports and trade, here we see a chart displaying U.S. dry natural gas production on the left and across key cases, and then LNG exports on the right. Similarly, and the price of gas and the availability has pretty significant impacts in terms of how much gas is exported. Anywhere from reference case of about getting up to 5 TCF per year. If oil prices are high, that could drive demand globally for gas, and thus lead to double, twice as much gas exports via LNG. But there are, certainly are situations where if resources are lower, or if oil prices are lower, there's less incentive then to export LNG. Here we have a slide looking at natural gas consumption and exports in 2020 and then 2050 for the reference case in those two supply cases. In the reference case, the increases in natural gas demand come from the industrial sector, which grows 3.6 TCF, and in net exports, which grow 4.7 TCF. During this time period, the growth in electric power and transportation commercial usage of natural gas is about 0.4 TCF each. The growth patterns for electric power and natural gas consumption and net exports change most dramatically depending upon how the price of gas evolves. So in cases where you have high gas supply, which results in low gas prices, there's significantly more consumption in electric power generation and exports. That's seen here in this middle chart. Then just quickly looking at oil and liquids, so natural gas plant liquids, NGLs. You can see here that domestic crude oil and natural gas plant liquids, they return to their pre-COVID levels starting in 2023. In the long term, that production continues to grow and then stabilizes. If oil prices are higher than the reference case, then, if oil prices are higher, then you do get more production. Similarly, if you have better resources, you can also have larger wells and cheaper wells, and that can drive up production and then exports more quickly. So in the right-hand chart, you can see, as mentioned earlier, the reference case having upwards of 2 million barrels a day of net exports. But if you higher oil prices or more supply, you can get up to 7 or 10 million barrels a day of net exports. But whereas in the previous slides about natural gas, where you continue to be a net exporter throughout the projections, that's not the case for petroleum products in a low oil gas price. So with that, just wanted to, there's a few links here to some of the main pages for material that I've talked about today. And I'll happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think you can hear me, but you can't see me, right?
Correct.
Yeah, me neither. Okay, I think they have to turn on my camera. Okay, now. Okay, John, well,
Should I
thank you.
stop sharing, or
What's that, sorry?
should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, I think it's better if you stop sharing your screen, yeah. Okay, John, well, thank you very much. We've got a couple of questions for you. The first one is, what drives wind addition beyond 2024 after tax credits expire? Is it more like the market? Is it because there's going to be new auctions? What do you think?
So there are some requirements for offshore wind. There are a few states that are pushing for some offshore development along the East Coast. But beyond that, it is really market-based. And so because solar provides the most power during the peak value points in the day, late afternoon when air conditioning needs are the greatest, as well as kind of that, just the way the season, the sun always shines even on a cloudy day. The solar really becomes more competitive than wind, which has generally there's more wind at night, so it's not quite as valuable at that point in the day, as well as kind of some of the seasonal factors for wind. So that's wind definitely slowing in terms of its additions.
Okay, thanks, John. There's another question where they say, well, the US has more than 80,000 installed megawatts of cogeneration, mostly on industrial sites. Do you have some kind of estimation regarding the share of this cogeneration in the natural gas increasing generation you showed in several slides? Is there participation?
I don't remember those numbers off the top of my head, but we definitely do. If you go into our tables, you can see the amount of cogeneration. And so it's probably better for me to if people want to reach out and with a specific question, I can get back to them.
Okay, that's great. Okay, thanks. They're telling us if you can give more details about offshore and support measures for offshore.
For wind or for?
Yeah, for wind.
For wind?
Yeah.
I think there are a number of state renewable portfolio standards that have been put in place that are trying to encourage wind development, and so those are represented in our document. If you go to our annual energy outlook webpage, kind of down on the lower right hand side, there's a section that says assumptions to the report, and then one of the chapters within that assumptions document discusses legislation and regulation. And there it is a full listing of all of the incentives that are being represented. And so you can get into the details at the state level of what exact, whether requirements for share of electricity to come from particular types of sources, whether it's wind or solar, just in general, low carbon type fuels, as well as tax incentives that are, stimulating additional investment in wind or solar, et cetera.
Okay. Okay. Another question which has to do a lot with the answers you're giving. So you're saying we're seeing how the state policies actually push very much the evolution of the energy in the U.S. But not so much policies coming from the federal government. So if the state's laws is the one that's pushing energy towards one place or the other, what kind of thing can the federal government do? Does it have to do more with tax incentives, or how does it go? Basically, the organization of policies in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And if you look back at what has happened in the U.S. And try to separate out whether it is state policy or federal policy that's led to it, it's really hard to say that it's one or the other. The production tax credits for wind initially, they probably brought us down the learning curve far enough that then the state standards were able to push a little bit further, and many of the states have increased the requirements in their standards, the renewable portfolio standards over time, and have pushed especially in the wind sector. It doesn't seem that those standards are increasing faster than the market will bear at this point. We actually see in many of the states, the amount of wind generation is higher than the portfolio standards. And so, you know, it's, you can, if you look at the details and kind of spend some time with the data, you can see how those two kind of the federal and state policies and incentives have kind of helped each other, contributed to the change in the market dynamic. But part of it too was initially many of the kind of grid operators were concerned about the reliability of in the US. There's a large focus on reliability of power. And so initially people were concerned about that, but as people have become more comfortable with these intermittent sources, there's been less concern about that. Obviously there's uncharted territory because of, at least within the US market in terms of how much renewables are operating, but we've had Today in Energy articles highlighting some of the events in Texas where they have a lot of wind and they've had some really good wind days that have generated a lot of electricity out of wind in the markets altogether. So.
Okay. If we continue a bit about policies, there are two more questions on policies. They're saying that the European Union and Japan are committing to net zero emissions by 2050. And if your assumption from what the chart you shown on emissions by 2050 is the assumption of no regulation realistic enough to support, say, the result of the studies that you showed?
So what we represent in the reference case is if we don't do anything else. So it provides a baseline that then your members could say, well, what if I added an additional incentive or added an additional regulation to the model? And the modeling system that we use to generate the annual energy outlook is free. People can download it. There's some software requirements that you have to purchase, et cetera, but you could go and download it and run the model and make different assumptions about whether it's carbon taxes or specific policies of limits, constraints in the model, and see what happens. We're definitely very interested in evolving the model to understand how far can we push it. And we have each year in the spring, we have working group meetings and extend into the summer where stakeholders talk with them about what we're thinking about doing. They can share ideas and topics that they're interested in seeing us model. And so, currently there's obviously a lot of discussion about deep decarbonization, net zero emissions. And so that's a topic we're looking into in terms of what would it take. The thing to remember about deep decarbonization is it's just, it will have, the market will look very different. And so then you have to begin to think about, well, how will people move? How will products be moved? What is the real cost of generating steel or, et cetera, using hydrogen instead of coal in the steelmaking process, just many things that would need to happen in a very different market. And so, there's a fair amount of work that needs to happen in order to represent that effectively in a complex model like what we use for this publication.
Okay. Just to end up on policies, just before going into other things, they're asking you about the Biden administration. First, what does it really mean for the US to go back into the Paris Agreement, energy-wise, for the US? And then they're asking you about the approved stimulus packages, the $1.9 trillion that was just approved a couple of days ago. And if energy is within this stimulus package, is green energy or sustainable energy going to be used to receive part of this amount to stimulate economy?
Right. So in terms of the first question, what Erica discussed at the beginning is that EIA doesn't get into policy, or we model policy, but we don't advocate for policy. And so there's a number of executive actions that have come out of the president's office since Biden took office, and following what's on the whitehouse.gov website would probably be the best place to start. So I'll defer on that.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And in terms of your second question, in terms of the new stimulus, $1.9 trillion stimulus bill, I did go looking for the language for that bill. I've not actually seen the language. I think it's still some negotiation that had been occurring when I was looking last week, so it's not as clear. One of the Energy Act of 2020 that was passed in December, which included stimulus funding for a variety of energy type issues. You can go look at the language there. I ran across a number of journal articles that talked kind of through and summarized some of those pieces. So that's probably the best place to go look. Obviously, we'll be looking through that and incorporating that into our reference case for the next outlook looking out next year.
Okay, great, thanks, John. You have 3 questions on hydrogen, which is really a big deal here now in Spain. They're asking you how you see hydrogen as an energy vector from 2050. Do you have estimations of production and consumption on hydrogen? Which sectors do you have will take hydrogen like an energy vector? What's your point of view on this?
Yeah, we have some, but it's a very, very small amount of hydrogen in our modeling at this point. The economics just have not been there yet. And so it definitely requires either breakthroughs or policy levers to push hydrogen into the market. Yeah, my background's in physics, and hydrogen's a very small molecule. It's hard to hold on to. And so there's costs there, there's pressurization issues. It's certainly seems to be a way to move towards an alternative fuel density type approach. Batteries at some point just become too expensive to they take up too much space. They weigh too much on a large truck. If you're doing shipping, semi-trailer type situation. So hydrogen would be a more feasible option there. There's just a lot going on. It depends on kind of how policy evolves in terms of what gets incentivized.
Okay. And last 2 questions, because we're almost over time, is what's the future in the US of nuclear and coal generation? Say your projections that you showed means nuclear and coal capacity are going to remain more or less the same. Are they going to go down? Are they going to go up? What's your forecast on this? What's happening in the US right now with nuclear and coal?
Right. So there's been an effort to add some new nuclear power plants in Georgia. Those have been significant cost overruns, and it's just very little incentive in terms of, because solar is so attractive, and there's a lot of work that's going into trying to figure out energy storage to support solar in terms of what types of batteries will help you get that solar 4 hours later into the evening, because if you can do that, then you can really displace a lot of other costs in terms of fuel, etc. So there's not a lot of opportunity for coal and nuclear to grow within the market. 1% growth in demand is more than the last decade, but it's still not a large, growing market for electricity. So that's just competitive.
But you see, say, coal or nuclear shutdown?
We certainly have seen. So we see a fair amount of coal shutdowns through 2025. Partly incentivized by the ACE rule that has now been vacated by the courts, but it's been this movement to retire the less efficient plants. And so really the most efficient ones will be left. But even there's a kind of an onward declining generation from coal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Arcadio, it's 6 o'clock, so if you want, we can finish here.
Okay, maybe we have more questions here, but more or less in the same direction. No? Coal, the forecast for 2050, maybe next year we will have the opportunity to see more of these things, John. No, it's a pleasure having you here. As you can see, there is a lot of interest here about the policy in the States, and you are starting a new administration. No? We'll see what happens in the near future. I hope you will have here, you and Erika, next year. That time, this is the best time to present this outlook, I think, because it was released last week. Maybe we will have your interest here at that time, no, next year here or before. Whatever you want, we are open to present or to introduce one of your report, because this is very appreciative for our people, no, who are listen to you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Erika, and muchas gracias a todos. Esperemos que podamos continuar con los informes de la Agencia de Información de Energía Americana en los próximos meses. Erika, muchas gracias por tu apoyo y a la Embajada en ponernos en contacto con John. Thank you very much, all of them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Buenas tardes.
Bye.
Adiós.
Bye bye.
See you soon. Bye.